What's up, guys? We're looking at the Wiki Socion again, and in particular, we're going to be taking a look at asymmetric relations. And these are at least to me the most interesting intertype relations in Socionics, and what really sets Socionics apart from other typologies, like for example the MBTI. In Socionics, you have these characterizations, these general characterizations of relationships that should, in theory, quote unquote, with reference to Socionics or according to Socionics, should in theory develop, okay, based on the relation of functions from one person to another, okay, or you could say like the order of the functions, okay. So you're probably like, oh, what is this even, like, what's the point? Because it's like, all right, there's symmetric relations and there's asymmetric relations. Okay, there's symmetric relations, which are kind of like in Socionics, they're kind of boring because it's really almost like your MBTI. Like you get the same stuff in MBTI, but the difference is with like in MBTI circles. Like in MBTI, they won't straight out say, okay, there are these relations that you can expect, like Socionics does. But it's like you'll hear people talking about functions in such a way where they're like, oh, well, like my dominant function is TE, so, people that have, this function in this position, I don't get along with them. Like it's the same, it's very similar kind of talk where Socionics tries to be a little bit more rational with it, but with the symmetric relations, it doesn't always get there. With the asymmetric relations, however, they're cool. Like we're going to take a look at the benefit relations in this video. And with asymmetric relations, the orders of the functions between two people are such that they don't match up in such a way where both people are like perceive each other as equals. And that's kind of cool. Because for one, you might be like, okay, so what's the point of this? Well, one, it's a nice way to try to look at typology from an empirical standpoint, because you should expect specific things to happen that either do or do not. You could use it to say, if you buy into type, you could use it to confirm or deny your type because of these asymmetric relations that are very specific. Whereas in MBTI, you don't really get anything that's this specific. So, okay, we've been talking for a little bit already. I haven't even really described what it is. So, basically, the benefit relations or the social request, and I could even make another video on this if I don't go too deep into it. But basically, it's like you have a beneficiary here, and you have a benefactor. And the benefactor underestimates the beneficiary, and the beneficiary overestimates the benefactor. Whereas if you look at symmetric relations, there's no hierarchy like this, where like one person's higher and one person's lower. But in benefit and supervision relations, which I'll probably make another video on supervision, but in the benefit relations, there is a hierarchy where one person's like considered to be I don't know. One person's considered to be like, I guess, like the leader of this, of these relations. Okay, and that would be like the benefactor. So there's a lot to it, but we can start and we can say that, okay, well, the one person's leading function, so the beneficiary's, we can say dominant function, corresponds to the benefactor's activating function, or the third function. So if you're from like MBTI, that would be like the tertiary function. So the dominant to the tertiary. And then you have the creative function of the benefactor is corresponding to the suggestive function or the beneficiary. So in like MBTI talk or like Jungian typology talk, it would be, well, no, just MBTI talk, because you know what I'm talking about, like MBTI or BB talk. The creative function falls on the suggestive. So that's Socionics for the auxiliary of the benefactor corresponds to the inferior of the beneficiary. So what ends up happening is that, and it's like there's other stuff too, but just to start off talking about it, it's like, so this person, the beneficiary, is interesting to the benefactor in because in that they have like a very powerful they have their dominant function is very powerful with respect to the same function that corresponds to the tertiary of the benefactor. Okay, and the beneficiary really appreciates the creative function or the auxiliary function of the benefactor. Okay, so that's where you get like the one's higher than the other, because the suggestive function is supposedly like you have less awareness of your inferior function, and you're looking for somebody in socionics. And like, okay, so if you can say in socionics, that's like the hypothesis or the theory, you can say, okay, socionics says that in real life you should expect somebody to be looking for their inferior function from other people. So the benefactor has the auxiliary function. Let's look. I'll take a look at specific types in a second. But it's like the benefactor doesn't really like care so much about the activating function as they would receiving information on the inferior or suggestive function, because that's like what they really want help with. But they can help the beneficiary with their inferior, but the beneficiary is not going to be helping the benefactor with their suggestive. So the benefactor can get a little bit annoyed at the beneficiary because it's like, well, I keep having to help you with your inferior function, whereas I'm not getting nearly as much in return. At least that's how they see it. Like, that's the cool thing about it, is asymmetric. So there's like there's supposedly a difference in perception. Okay. So as for the beneficiary is like, okay, well, this person can help me with my inferior function, and then it's also kind of fun to talk about, like, I talk about my dominant function all the time. This is from the perspective of the beneficiary. Like, I'm doing whatever has to do with my dominant function. I'm generally doing that, and that is corresponding to something that the benefactor is sometimes interested in. Okay, so you could take a look at other types and specific types, and you could say, okay, well, let's think about, like, say, INTJ and INFP, because there's a ton of people online that are like, oh, well, I think I'm INTJ, so it's just like a popular type. So this could help you like confirm or deny, but like, if you're on this channel and you're listening to this, you probably are already sure of your type, and you're probably not like, and you're probably like, pretty advanced with reference to this stuff if you've made it this far. So you don't need me like telling you how to confirm or deny your type. But basically, the person who is the beneficiary in this case, so INFP, leads with introverted feeling, which corresponds to the activating function of someone who's INTJ. It corresponds to their tertiary function. So it's like the person who's the benefactor enjoys talking about introverted feeling stuff, but doesn't like, it's not their dominant function. But the person who is the beneficiary, introverted feeling is like their bread and butter. So a little bit of that, there's a little bit of that. That's one aspect. And then you could say that extroverted thinking is the auxiliary or creative function for the benefactor, and the inferior or suggestive for the beneficiary. So the beneficiary is going to constantly need I guess you could say reassurance and like help with their inferior function, which you can say in this case, if it's INFP and INTJ, it's that the beneficiary's inferior or suggestive function is extroverted thinking. And you could say, okay, well, the benefactor might get a little annoyed with this, because it's like, okay, well, I have to keep helping you with, and this is just in general, this is not like specific. So it's like, this is like one possible consequence is like, well, I have to keep helping you with extroverted thinking, but all I'm getting in return is introverted feeling stuff, but I don't really I need help on extroverted sensing stuff. So then the other point to that is that extroverted sensing for somebody that's INFP is their I forgot what they call it, and is the blind spot function in Socionics, or the trickster function in like BB. It's like a shadow function. So it's like things that the beneficiary are strong with, and the benefactor should be taking some heed on, or should be open to advice on, they're not. Because it's like, okay, extroverted feeling would be a strong function for the beneficiary, in this case INFP, but for somebody that's INTJ, they're like, I don't want to hear, like, it's something that they're averse to. So it's like they technically should be listening to the beneficiary on things that they're strong with, but they're not really able to receive that information. So it makes it asymmetric, because the benefactor feels like they're not getting shit in return and basically like babysitting the beneficiary, whereas they're really missing some important information that they could gain if they were able to listen to the beneficiary. And so what ends up happening is the beneficiary basically puts in like all of this work in to try to get the benefactor to see these things that they're missing coming from their strong functions. So in the case of like INFP, it's feeling. And the benefactor is like, I don't understand why there's all these problems. Like, you know, like neither of them really understand why there's problems in communication. Like even if you still read Socionics, it's still in practice, it's still like confusing. But it's like neither of them really understand what the problem is, and they kind of get along superficially. But there's just some annoyance because it's like, okay, so let's say you're like just talking from the perspective of the benefactor. If you were talking to any other NPs, then you would have like an equal, like you wouldn't feel yourself to be in a higher position. Okay, so there's a little bit of that to it. It's also interesting because it's like it's interesting because even if you know about Socionics and you know about type and you know about these types of asymmetric relations, it doesn't really help much. It does in the respect that the benefactor is kind of acting like a manager to some degree. So it's like, okay, well, the degree to which you're able to understand your beneficiary is like reflects your maturity in dealing with people that like need your help or need you to kind of lead them in some ways. So it's like somebody who is INTJ and gets annoyed with their beneficiary who's INFP on asking for help with extroverted thinking. It's like, okay, well, you're just the benefactor in that case would be kind of like immature, because it's like, well, in life you generally have, like, if you're going to go anywhere in life, you have people that are quote unquote under you that you should be able to help. You know, that's just a fact of life. So it's like if you're unable to do that, that means you're basically not fit to be giving anybody advice, because you can't even explain it to your Socionics beneficiary, right? Which is like supposed to be, if you're looking at Socionics as something that's able to make testable theories. If you're looking at it that way, then it should be like a natural thing, in that it exists whether or not you have Socionics or not. Like these things are supposed to be real. It's not just Socionics. It's like these things are real, and Socionics and typology and like BB and all that are trying to describe it. Okay, so the other cool thing is that these things, like these relations are in a ring, as opposed to like the symmetric relations. So it's like basically the tension, you could say, like the annoyance that's felt and like the unresolvedness that is experienced in a asymmetric relation, because for example, like the beneficiary may get the short end of the stick in their relation with benefactor. So INFP with reference to INTJ. But it's passed along, because it's like if the INFP person's like, well, you know, this, or it's passed along. Say we flip it and we go ISTP and INTJ, whereas the benefactor is now ISTP and the beneficiary is now INTJ. The benefactor's creative function is extroverted sensing. So the ISTP person's like, I have to keep helping this INTJ person with extroverted sensing stuff, and the beneficiary who's INTJ is like, well, this benefactor has like basically no imagination, and I'm trying to kind of help them out with introverted intuition stuff. But the activating functions, like the benefactor just is not open to the beneficiary's activating function, which is, in this case, for INTJ and ISTP, the beneficiary's activating function or tertiary function is a feeling function. So, in particular, it's introverted feeling. So the benefactor in this case is like not open. They're not open to introverted feeling, and then they're also they're the beneficiary in this case is like shadow leading function. So like their function that's like opposite the dominant function that's also strong is extroverted intuition, and that corresponds to the benefactor's blind spot. So the benefactor can't even so basically it's like some of the things that a lot of the things the beneficiary wants to be talking about, the benefactor just like is completely not open to it. So the beneficiary in this case, who's INTJ, could be like, well, this is really annoying. Like I'm trying to help this person out with like things I'm good with, and I do appreciate when they help me out with this stuff, but it's annoying because they don't care about introverted feeling or extroverted intuition. And extroverted intuition is something I'm really strong at, so they should probably be listening to that, but they're not, so it's just annoying. And so the beneficiary kind of over exerts, or like can be liable to putting in too much effort. They won't get repaid with. So both ways, both people won't get repaid, but in the individual relation. But with the fact that it's supposedly in a ring of 4, if the beneficiary was INTJ and the benefactor was ISTP, then this gets passed on to another relation in which the benefactor is INTJ and the beneficiary is INFP. So previously, with the other relation with INTJ ISTP, the benefactor, who is now INTJ, is like, wow, it was so annoying. It was so annoying. Like I had it was so annoying being in this asymmetric relation where this person wasn't listening to things I was strong with or things I wanted to talk about. We only talked about things they wanted to talk about. So when they meet their beneficiary, then they switch roles. They are now the benefactor, and they're like, well, what could I not really talk about that I wanted to talk about? Introverted feeling and extroverted intuition. Well, what does that happen to be? That happens to be the strengths of INFP, which is the beneficiary. So then going further down the ring, the beneficiary is who's now INFP is like, wow, this is annoying. I can't talk about introverted sensing, which is my tertiary or activating function, because the benefactor doesn't care about it or is like really bad at it. And then I also can't talk about extroverted feeling, which is like the opposite of leading function. So I can't talk about introverted sensing, and I can't talk about extroverted feeling because the benefactor is absolutely horrible in these regards, and won't listen to me about it because they don't think I should have any authority. So that's basically how that works. But then that gets passed again. So it gets passed again talking about just there's 4 rings of benefit. We're talking about just this one. So that gets passed again, where we have at the benefactor, now we have INFP, and the beneficiary is ISFJ. So the INFP person who was previously in an asymmetric relation with somebody who was INTJ is like, well, I couldn't talk about introverted sensing, and I couldn't talk about extroverted feeling with this other person because that was not their wheelhouse. They didn't understand it at all. So now my creative function, which is in this case, if it's INFP is the benefactor, they're like, my creative function, extroverted intuition. Now I am in a higher perception wise, like just between these two. If you bring in other people, they won't see this. But if you just between these two, it's like, well, I have unless the person's aware of like Socionics, it's like now this person is listening to me because I'm giving them advice on their inferior, which would be extroverted intuition in this case, because you have ISFJ and INFP. But the INFP person's like, better yet, now I actually get somebody to talk to me about introverted sensing, because the ISFJ person's dominant function is introverted sensing. So the INFP is like, okay, cool. Now I can actually talk about introverted sensing stuff. I can get some nice advice on my tertiary function and some really refined advice on my third function. And like I can also talk about feeling stuff, or more specifically my extroverted feeling, because the beneficiary is creative with extroverted feeling. But the other caveat to that I didn't even bring in before is that like the opposite of your dominant function that's like also strong. So if you're an introverted feeler, then extroverted feeling is like in Socionics your ignoring function. So it even adds to the annoyance, because it's like the beneficiary, if they're ISFJ, their creative function is extroverted feeling. So they're really good with extroverted feeling, but the benefactor is like, yeah, so what? You know, they're like, it's their dominant function is the opposite of that. So in the case of INFP, it's like the dominant function is introverted feeling. So they're kind of like, they have like a laissez-faire attitude, or maybe even a more negative, like slightly tinged negative attitude towards extroverted feeling in some cases, where they're just like, whatever, you know, like I like introverted feeling a little bit better. So it's more from the benefactor's perspective. It's like, okay, cool. Now I get to talk about my activating function. So I get some advice on introverted sensing, but it's kind of annoying because I have to keep helping this person with extroverted intuiting. But it's like, it's variable. So it's like, if the person who's the benefactor is like capable of managing people, or capable of understanding people and assuming that role of being like, I guess, like, quote unquote above someone, then the relation's not as bad because they're used to it. But if the person is not able to do that, then it's like horrible, because it's like the person gets annoyed. So now on, oh wow, we're at like 20 minutes. So now we're on to the fourth like segment of this like ring, right? So we said first was like INTJ ISTP, then INTJ INFP, and then INFp ISFJ. Now we're back to where it started. Okay, so this is a cool thing about, at least to me, about like the asymmetric relations, and we'll talk about supervision next. But this is for benefit or social request, is because the quote unquote request has come full circle. So, like, first we started with the benefactor being ISTP and being annoyed, just like, I don't want to keep helping this person out with extroverted sensing. Like, I don't like, and also they like don't care about like most of the other things that the beneficiary is talking about. Like, they don't give a shit about introverted feeling. They don't give a shit about extroverted intuition. So the person who's INTJ is like lower in that respect to the benefactor. But it's all come full circle because now we're at ISFJ, ISTP, right? Where the benefactor is ISFJ and the beneficiary is ISTP. So it's weird because in all these cases, there's one person that's technically like, from a perception point of view, is like higher than the other person, but at the same time, they're all equal with respect to the ring of benefit, because each person has a beneficiary and each person has a benefactor. So if we look at ISFJ being the benefactor and ISTP being the beneficiary, ISFJ, their creative function is extroverted feeling, and the inferior function of the ISTP is also extroverted feeling. So the benefactor is like, look at this person like making all these, like being super socially weird and like constantly needing help in not being an asshole, you know, or like whatever extroverted feeling problems they have. And they're like, okay, well, I'll help this person out, but, you know, like, this is like, they're making kind of minor mistakes, or they're mistakes that like, they're making big mistakes that like are easily avoidable in through the benefactor's viewpoint, because the benefactor spent like a lifetime being good at this. So they're looking at it like, how could this person be so bad at this, you know? And the leading function of the ISTP is introverted thinking. So the tertiary function of the ISFJ is also introverted thinking. So the benefactor could be like, wow, this is cool. Like, if they're ISFJ, they could be like, I like doing some introverted thinking things from, you know, every now and then. So it's cool to have somebody to talk about this stuff with. But it is also annoying that I have to keep helping them because they keep making all these mistakes. And then the other part to that is like the beneficiary, who at this point in time is now ISTP. Their activating or tertiary function is introverted intuition. So they could be like, you know, let's talk about like, I want to talk about some things that that like I've realized, or maybe I've had these self-realizations, and or like I want to share my perspective on like global issues or whatever. And the benefactor's like, get that shit out of here. Like, I really do not want to talk about that, because it's a function that they're really bad with. It's like the shadow of their inferior function. So it's like they're horrible with it. So they're like, please get that away from me. I don't want to hear it. But the beneficiary would like to talk about it. And also the leading function, so the opposite of the opposite function of the dominant function for the beneficiary, who's an ISTP, is extroverted thinking. For the benefactor, it is their blind spot function. So they just like they will like they'll get they have a tendency to get extroverted thinking things totally wrong but not really realize it. So it's annoying for both of them because the beneficiary is like, hey, I can help you out with this thing that you're bad at. And the benefactor is like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not a thing. Or like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I don't need help here. Or like the benefactor may get the beneficiary, like if the beneficiary doesn't know this stuff or doesn't realize it, the benefactor may be telling the beneficiary that they actually have things wrong when they have it right. But since the beneficiary is technically like the lower person in this in the relation, they won't notice that. So it's just cool because like we started with two functions and we started with the one type being the benefactor, then going through the rings of benefit to them being the beneficiary. So it's like it's just cool because on a one-on-one basis it's asymmetric, but since it's symmetric with regard to the ring, it's like people watching this shit happen are like, I don't understand. Like some people watching might be like, yeah, like the benefactor and the beneficiary may even look like similar over time. Because, for example, if you have the beneficiary is like trying to learn about their inferior function. So once they start developing that, then they take into account what the benefactor has said, and they start to become a little bit more like superficially like the benefactor. That's why it's one of the reasons why I think like people commonly get ISTP and ENTJ mixed up, is because they're benefactor and beneficiary, and over time they'll start to look a little bit more similar. And for example, since the benefactor, the benefactor in that respect also will have their own beneficiary, they start to look more like their beneficiary, and vice versa. So yeah, so that's not everything, but it covers like most of the stuff for the benefit relations. It's cool asymmetric relation. If you guys have made it this far, this is almost like a half an hour, so I'd be surprised if anybody really makes it this far. But if you do, let me know if you want me to make other videos on this. I could make a shorter one just talking about certain types and stuff like that, but it's a cool relation, and we'll talk about, because like the one thing that I'd like to talk about in another video about supervision relations, which is like an even more asymmetric relation, is that like the person, so the person that's a benefactor may feel themselves to be higher in terms of like social status in these relations and benefit. So the benefactor might be like, well, the beneficiary is just this like needy person who needs me to constantly explain to them things about their inferior function. But then it's funny because the supervisor, so an even more asymmetric relation where the person is like a supervisor to someone who is being supervised, the benefactor may look at the beneficiary and be like, you're a needy person who needs help on your inferior function, and then what you try and tell me is usually nonsense. Like that's how the benefactor might look at it. But a person like of another type who is closer to the beneficiary is the supervisor of the benefactor. So like if you're, say for example, like the benefactor is INTJ and the beneficiary is INFP, then the supervisor of INTJ is ENFJ. And ENFJ understands like people that are like are ENFJ and INFP, they're like close enough together where they can understand each other's strengths. So like the person who's the benefactor who's INTJ may be like, well, this person keeps giving me all this irrelevant information on extroverted feeling that's really useless to me because like it's just not, it's like this person shouldn't be telling me anything. They're in no position to be giving me advice. And then the person who's a supervisor, which is like ENFJ, would be like, no, your beneficiary is technically correct because you're like kind of a piece of shit when it comes to extroverted feeling, and you really don't you really don't understand some things that you probably should be looking into more, and it's kind of making your life it's making your life fucked up in some ways that you're not paying attention to, and that kind of makes you stupid. So, and then the so the benefactor has another asymmetric relation with their supervisor, who looks at the beneficiary as a person who's completely normal. You know what I mean? They don't look down on them. So it's just funny the way these things work out. So I'll leave it there because I've been talking for a good long time, but I haven't seen shit on I haven't seen really any good videos on asymmetric relations and socionics on YouTube. So I made this first one, and I could always break it down into shorter pieces or longer ones, or talk about it more in the future. So yeah, thanks for watching if you made it this far, and I'll see you guys in another video.